Afternoon, listeners to New Style Radio. You've been listening to extracts from a record called African Troubadours, the best of African singers, songwriters. I've got thousands of CDs, but I love this particular one, so I hope you've been enjoying it too. We're privileged to be having a special program this afternoon, and even more privileged to have with us Professor Kamel Awash, who is Professor of Engineering at the University of Birmingham, and he will probably tell us a little about the type of engineering he is. But he's also an enormous supporter of the Palestinian people, which is very unusual, unlike many academics who make a separation between what's happening in the world and what's happening in their personal life. Professor Awash, it's an honor and a privilege to have you. Welcome once again. You've been here. You've privileged with being here before. You've been here before. Welcome once again into our studios.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Philip. It's really appreciated. Just quickly about myself. So my name is Kamel Hawash, and both of my parents were born in Jerusalem, but they were in Saudi Arabia, where my father was working when I was born. So I have not lived in Palestine, but there are the roots. Jerusalem, both of my parents. And I remember in 1967 watching my mother cry, and I was 5. And I would say to her, "Why are you crying?" And what I remember her saying is, your grandmother has been occupied. That's how it came to me. Obviously, I asked more questions and so on. But I also remember her then participating in fundraising for the Palestinian people and sewing the Palestinian flag. So you couldn't just order it on Amazon then. So she was creating it, and they fundraised and so on. Because my parents were outside Palestine in 1967, they were not allowed to return and live in Jerusalem as you might expected they would do. So it wasn't until 1969 that I actually visited Palestine and met my family, both my grandmothers and so on, and made friends with my relatives. So that goes back to 1969 when I was able to go. And then we visited, I think, another once or twice. And then I didn't visit. At the age of 15, my father put me on a plane to come to the UK to do an English language course. And then I stayed, did my schooling, studied engineering, and now I teach at the University of Birmingham. My area is civil engineering, and I specifically look after construction management and in particular how we can improve the teaching of engineering, which is quite a significant thing. In my other time, I campaign for Palestine. So I am a Palestinian. I'm also very honored, but it comes with a huge responsibility to be the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is an organization that was set up in 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. So we're talking about events today. Just think that even in 1982, Israel was acting in a violent way, invading Lebanon, supposedly to end the PLO and Yasser Arafat and so on, but refusing to implement any United Nations resolutions that would bring peace. So I think maybe as an introduction, I hope that helps the listeners.
And hopefully, Professor Awash, your students would have prevented bridges from falling down.
Or buildings.
Buildings for that matter.
Yeah.
Professor Awash, one of the important elements of what's happening with the Palestinian people is that people feel that they know the Jewish people, they're connected to the Bible. But I believe overwhelmingly most people would feel that they have no conception of who the Palestinian people are. Can you briefly say something to us about how you would situate the Palestinian people in terms of ancient history? Everyone knows about the Bible, they know about the Jews in the Bible, but they know very little about the Palestinian people. Would you situate the Palestinian people in terms of the ancient civilizations such as Iraq, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Carthaginians, what have you? Just situate them for us and let us know where they were, because even I ought to know better. At a drop of a hat, I couldn't be able to tell you that the Palestinian people come from here, whereas I can tell you where the people from Carthage comes from. So say to us a little about how you situate the Palestinian people in the ancient world.
So we can go back as far as who are the people called the Canaanites.
Okay.
So goes back nearly 6,000 years or so.
Okay, so they're pharaonic.
Preceded
their time of the Egyptians. Yes.
Yeah, they preceded
Okay.
the creation of Judaism.
Okay.
And that's significant because, and indeed, just to add to this, the oldest city in the world is Jericho. Okay, 10,000.
Most of our listeners would be very much aware of Joshua. In fact, a lot of Jamaicans and
Exactly.
Caribbean people like to talk about
So-
Joshua and his stick and all of that.
Yeah,
So.
and so Jericho is the oldest city. My relatives live in Jericho, so the attachment is first of all that I have family. Unfortunately, two of my uncles who lived in Jericho have passed away, but I have cousins in Jericho and other relatives. The other thing to say is that the Palestinians have continuously lived in that land. So we often hear from the pro-Israelis that, oh, this is our historic biblical homeland. We've lived there all. They haven't. 2,000 years ago is when they were last there as the Jewish people, and they live there are Jews who live all over the world, but you cannot trace and say this is where I come from. Indeed, because there are so many different types of Jewish people who follow a faith, just like Muslims. I'm a Muslim. I follow a faith. I look to Mecca, if you like, that I have a strong attachment to that, and Medina, where the Prophet Muhammad is buried. But I don't say I have a right to go and live there. And that's really significant to what we have in Palestine. In other words, for Jews to say, that's our historic, that we have returned. No, you haven't. You've gone and taken someone else's land to create a state for you.
We will talk about what happened.
But in terms of what I'm trying to say is, then there were, but the Middle East was open, so people moved around. It isn't that the Palestinians only stayed there, or nobody came, or nobody left. But then we had one of the Khalifas who followed Prophet Muhammad went and opened Jerusalem. It became a Muslim city, if you like. But just think of this is really important to Christians particularly, that when he landed in Jerusalem, he wanted, the prayer time came. So they said to him, why don't you pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? He said, no, because if I do that, they'll turn it into a mosque. So he prayed outside it, and there's now a mosque with his name. So the Palestinians stayed there, and then in 1917, Britain decided, so that follows on from that, to issue a promise to the Zionist movement.
The Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration,
yes.
Which basically said, here's a land we don't own, but we will help you create a homeland for yourselves there. And then when they got the British mandate, when Sykes and Picot sat down and they divided the Middle East by drawing lines, straight lines, literally. So the Syrian people became Syria, the Jordanian people became Jordan, the Iraqis became Iraq, Lebanese became Lebanon. But when it came to the Palestinians, the British mandate was created. So Britain went into Palestine in 1922, I think 21 or 22. But when they asked the League of Nations to give them the ability to do that, they inserted the Balfour Declaration.
Can I ask you, what I think a lot of people probably understand, who probably don't understand history and get a little confused about history, but what they do know, they know about things like Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
That the Balfour Declaration, the British mandate, which you mentioned, was around the time, wasn't it? This is what Lawrence of Arabia was responsible for defeating the Turks. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So the Turks, and that's important. So the last people before the British
Yes.
who were there were the Turks.
I was going to ask you about this. Thanks for situating the Palestinian people so well historically. I did want you to say just a little about what was happening to the Palestinian people on the Turkish Empire, because that leads immediately to what I mentioned just now, Lawrence Arabia and modern times. So do you say a little about what was happening to the Palestinian people under the Turks?
Yeah, so they were part of the Turkish Empire. Indeed, my grandfather fought for the Turks.
Okay.
So that's, that was the entity that was there. Okay, some people call it an occupation. Others say not. It was the basically the extension of the Islamic Caliphate, if you like. But towards the end of the 1910s, the Turkish Empire was
So
defeated.
Turkey, the Turkish Empire,
Syria.
was this major, if I can say, Professor, was this major empire going back to when the Turks took over what was then Constantinople,
Yeah.
and it was a major. If I understand it correctly, the Turks almost defeated the entire Europe. So there was this major empire which
Yeah,
went
and-
to the 19th century.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And then so then the Ottoman Empire,
Yes, Ottoman, indeed.
the Ottoman
Yeah,
Empire,
they call
yeah.
it Ottoman
So that
Empire.
ruled over the whole of that Middle East, all the way down
And
to
Europe
including
also,
Saudi
and-
Arabia and parts of Europe and so on.
course.
But then it was defeated,
Yes.
and
And Lawrence of Arabia was part of that process of
yeah.
defeating the Turks, defeating the Turks, indeed,
Yeah.
Ottoman Empire in what is now Palestine. Yes?
And so then there was this Sykes-Picot agreement where they divided the land. So the
Indeed.
French and the British said,
Yes.
you take this bit, we take that bit. And when it came to Palestine, the British had a mandate. They didn't allow the indigenous Palestinian, like the Syrians, like the Lebanese, to create an independent Palestine. Okay? During the mandate, all the passports, all the birth certificates, my mother's birth certificate, her marriage certificate, birth certificate, not the marriage certificate, had the title of the British Mandate on Palestine. So that's what it says on her birth certificate, British Mandate on Palestine, and then it has. And she was born in 1943. So she was born before the creation of Israel. Okay.
So the British had what is called a mandate after they defeated the Turks.
Yeah.
And now, tell us how the Jewish people managed to take over Palestine. What happened there?
So so a promise was made to the Zionist movement, which was created in the late 1890s. That was when the movement was created. They wanted to gather the Jewish people. They were offered places like Argentina, Uganda, etc. But somehow they managed to convince the British, and as I say, the British were not yet in Palestine in 1917. They managed to convince them that they wanted to go back to that. So and then of course the British thought, good, we'll have a foothold. So a lot of people talk about Israel being an extension of settler colonialism, because as you know, that it gets support from all the former settler colonial countries. So basically the Balfour Declaration was inserted. The Palestinians were not allowed to develop, even though actually they were, if you go to Al Jazeera and search for Palestine 1920, you will find a documentary which tells you what Palestine was like in 1920. This is not after the Zionists came, and it was the most vibrant country, a functioning economy. The desert was blooming, even though the Zionists claimed they made the desert bloom. It's an absolute lie. So just bringing it forward, so in 1948, the British, so the percentage of Jews at the turn of the last century in Palestine was 6%. Muslims were the majority, and then there were about 10 to 15% Christians, but there is no way there could have been an independent homeland for the Jews. So they had to bring people in order for that to happen. So in 1948, as the British were leaving, the Zionist terrorist organizations, and they talk a lot about Palestinians as terrorists, but Zionist Irgun and the Haganah and other groups, they were terrorist organizations that committed atrocities against the Palestinian people. The British just left. In the process, then they started ejecting Palestinians, and 750,000 Palestinians, almost 3/4 of the population, was ejected to neighboring countries.
Why were the Jewish people in Palestine, and all of this happens in the 1930s, why were they so strong in comparison to the Palestinian people?
So after the Zionist movement started, they began to go and buy land in Palestine.
Okay.
And take over and create what they call kibbutzes and so on, looking to the future when they might have an entity the question of a state wasn't mentioned as a state, because obviously that's a modern day kind of naming. So they began to take land, to rise from the 6% upwards. The Palestinians who were initially under the Ottoman Empire, they recognized something was something is strange. But then the British came and the Jews started moving to Palestine before the Holocaust. So this is important. It's
In
not
the 30s.
it's not because
the
of the
started
Holocaust.
in around 1939.
And the Zionist movement started in 1898. So in other words, all of this was a decision to steal someone else's land before the Holocaust. So it's nothing to do with the Holocaust. Now, of course, after the Holocaust happened, Jews were moving. Many went to the United States, to Russia, to other places. But then some were
Holocaust
convinced.
was during the Second World War,
Yeah.
where the Nazis took over Germany. And
When they were ruling Germany, if you like, and
Ruling Germany,
other areas,
of course.
and the Holocaust was committed, the most heinous crime you can think of. But the ones who survived, a lot of them went to America and other European countries, but some decided to go to. They were pushed by the Zionists to go and
large
live
numbers.
in large numbers, so that the scales began to tip. And as you expel Palestinians and allow Jews in, you have a transfer of the population, ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, and the Jews come in. Not only do they come in, they go to Jaffa, which people will know for Jaffa oranges as well as other things.
Of course, yeah.
But protected by terrorist groups, they would knock a door down, throw the Palestinians out, take their homes, even while their food was hot.
Okay. So, Professor Awash, the Zionist, the Jewish movement, for the reasons you've explained to us, managed to dispossess
Yes.
a lot of Palestinian people. Now, what then happened? How did we come about having an Israeli Zionist state? What happened?
Yeah.
Explain what was
Yeah.
happening after the Second World War.
So first of all, those who were forced to leave went to Lebanon, to Syria, to Jordan, and they set up refugee camps. That's where the refugee issue comes from.
Yeah.
So they set up refugee camps. Israel decided when the British left to declare a state.
What year was this?
1948. So they declared the state. Now, in 1947, as there were fights between Jews and Palestinians, the United Nations issued the partition plan to say, we will divide Palestine, but although there were far fewer Jews than Palestinians, they gave them more than 49%. They gave them 51% of the land, and they decided the lines. Of course, the Palestinians, like any human being, said, no, you cannot take our homeland. So they refused to accept that. And then there were efforts to try and eject those who came to take the Palestinian homeland. In 1948, the Zionists won, and they created Israel. And it was recognized fairly quickly by America, by Russia, by other places, by Britain.
And that's significant. You mentioned Russia. Of course, during that period, the Russians were seen as supporters of the people of what we call the Third World. But exceptionally, they supported the creation of the State of Israel. So what I take it, Professor Awash, that what that means is that Israel had tremendous international support.
I would start from a slightly different point of view, which is what I've sort of realized over the last few years. Amongst the West, and indeed maybe Russia, there's anti-Arab racism. So they don't see the Arabs. Now, the Palestinians are part of the Arab nation. So the West doesn't see, and I mean the West, I mean Britain and America and others, doesn't see the Arab people as equivalent to them. They see them as lesser people, but clearly they see the Jews above that. So who do we stand with, the Jewish people or the Arab people? They stand with the Jewish people. And of course, they will bring the issue of the Holocaust, and that was, again, a heinous crime. But that shouldn't have resulted in a people being dispossessed. So if the Jewish people found an empty land and created a state for them, fine. But to force themselves onto another people's land, which was not a land without a people, you know the famous phrase, for a people without a land, it wasn't. It never was.
In fact, I must say to you, Professor Awash, despite the fact that it's anyone with any common sense would realize that this is false and not true. It's widely believed, this is a widely believed, that it was, as you say, the famous expression, a land without people, lots of people believe this.
So,
So
oh,
this is
well,
important.
why not? You know, in
This
that
is
case,
important.
no. So it was a complete lie because that's where the Palestinians come from. My relatives were there hundreds of years ago. My wife's relatives were there hundreds of years ago. So it was not an empty land. It was a complete lie. And of course, around that time, you didn't have media that could go and film, and unless it was controlled in a particular way. So, but bring it forward. So Israel began to build, basically, to develop. And in 1967, there was another war, the Six-Day War. Which
I was going to ask you,
yeah.
After the establishment of the Zionist state, would you give us a brief summary of what happened in Palestine between, because there were lots of major events like the Yom Kippur War, Could you summarize what's happening, bringing us right to what's going on now? I'm going to, please, just for educational purposes, for historical purposes, summarize what happened since 1948 for us.
Let me start with the word Zionism, because you used it again, the Zionist state.
What does Zionism? I was using
no, but what is Zionism? That's important. So pro-Israelis would claim Zionism is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. If they stopped there, I would have no problem in Palestine. You see that the second bit is the problem we have. If the Jewish people wanted to establish something for them that to exercise the right to self-determination, that's fine. But then to say in Palestine is the bit that we have a problem with. So when politicians here in the UK, like Keir Starmer, who's speaking, I think as we speak, says I'm a Zionist, he's not just saying I'm with the Jewish people having a right to self-determination, but in Palestine. In other words, the Palestinian people are dispensable. This is for the Zionists, i.e. the Jews. So that's just to explain, because people always say, oh, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No, it's not. If Zionism didn't include that second bit, fine. If they had gone to Uganda, and I'm not going to comment on whether that would have been right for the Ugandan people, but if they had...
Professor Awash, I don't wish to interrupt you, but many people don't realize that when the Zionists, as you described them, were thinking of setting up a state of their own, the first place they thought about was Uganda.
I understand Argentina.
Many of our listeners don't know this.
And then Uganda and so on. Okay. There's actually even an entity in Russia that there was thought they might create a state there. But the point is, they use this religious connection to say, no, we must go back to Palestine. Well, I'll just say something here which I think Christians will find interesting. Where did Christianity start? In Bethlehem.
Of course, in the Middle East.
Does every Christian have a right to go and live there?
Of course not.
So why, exceptionally, Jews have a right to go and live there? They shouldn't. I go to Mecca for pilgrimage. You might go and visit Bethlehem, pilgrimage. Jews could go and visit Jerusalem and other places on pilgrimage and then go home. So that is what should have happened, not that we must have that land. It's ours for eternity. God is not a real estate agent and gave them the land.
And what I don't think a lot of people realize is that every single Jewish person anywhere in the world has a right, without any formality, to return to Israel. Most people.
Whereas my mother, who lives here in Birmingham, was born in Jerusalem before 1948, is not allowed to go and live there. And when I came to bury my father, I had to bury him in Handsworth here because I couldn't take him back to be buried in Jerusalem, whereas Robert Maxwell was buried in Jerusalem. Well, let's not go into him.
What I was going to say.
So I'm going to come back to your question, but I hope that was helpful about Zionism and so on. Now, so after 1948, clearly the Palestinians were not happy about what happened. They were resisting. So, other Arab countries were trying to help them. And then the 1967 war broke out. And we don't want to spend too much time on it. But before the 1967 war, Israel existed on 78% of historic Palestine. The rest was with Egypt in the south, Gaza, and with Jordan in the east. So in 1967, and that included in the east, it included Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. So then Israel occupied, it defeated the armies, occupied the whole of the land, so it now controls 100%
And
of Palestine,
importantly, East Jerusalem.
including East Jerusalem.
Importantly, East Jerusalem, because
Yeah,
people
yeah,
know about
yeah.
Jerusalem.
And one of the first acts they did was to demolish the Moroccan quarter, because they wanted to have a space to pray where the what they call the Wailing Wall is. Yeah, so that was one of the first things, an act of violence and aggression, even on day one. Since then, they've claimed that Jerusalem is their united capital, so they annexed it formally in law, and Donald Trump, when he was president, recognized that annexation and even moved the embassy.
Whereas other American governments have refused to do
They
that.
had. So they would look at it every 6 months, but they would all say, we'll postpone it for 6 months. But he decided, he says it's been on the books and everyone knows it's no, it's not. He didn't even say, and I mean, Jerusalem is protected under international law as one entity. You see, it's excluded from resolutions as a sort of, you divide it, you have this and you have that. But he recognized the whole of it as Israel. So I come from what would be termed East Jerusalem. So does my wife. She comes from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So that's what happened after 67. The Palestinians there. This brings us a little bit to where we're coming.
Absolutely, because we need to talk about.
They were given different identification cards. So that's interesting in terms of. So those who were in Jerusalem were given the same colored ID card as Israelis, but it was a residency, which means if you're a resident only, they can get rid of you anytime by taking away your residency. And they've done that to about 10,000, 12,000 Palestinians from Jerusalem. There's a different color card for those who live in the West Bank and Gaza. So, and indeed, just for people who may be surprised, that those who live in the West Bank and Gaza, even their number plates on the cars are different to those used by Israelis. So you can tell which is an Israeli car, effectively, and which is a now, in 1967, the other thing they did was to start building what are illegal settlements, because these are occupied territories.
Where are these settlements, Professor Awash?
So if you hear of Ramallah, you hear of Nablus, you hear of Hebron, the first one they built was actually inside, in the center of Hebron, which has the tomb of the patriarch. So there are a few hundred settlers protected by thousands of soldiers. And they've been emptying the city from inside out, closing shops and so on. But so they started there and then they spread. They started placing them strategically, particularly on top of hills, so that they are above the Palestinian. And they would supply the settlements with electricity, with water as much as they want, and they would restrict that to the Palestinians who live there.
It's evident from what you're saying to us that the settlers, the Zionists, were intent on taking over as much of that area as possible.
Yeah.
Now, what did the Arab people do about, what is, they're human beings, they see what's going on, what did they do about this? What happened after 67?
Well, so over a period of time, they continued to resist, to say that's not on, we must have our land back. They went to international fora, to the United Nations, which has resolutions which say that's occupied territory. They wanted people to leave, the settlers to leave. But in fact, what Israel did was to say, no, the settlers will stay, but there will be one law for settlers, civil law, and one law for Palestinians, which is military law. So when a child is accused of something, they go and stand handcuffed and shackled in Israeli military courts. So there will be a soldier who decides what to do with them, and they have a 95% conviction rate. So, so basically, then Israel started to try and change, for example, Jerusalem, to try and plant settlements in the Palestinian areas, so that they would get to a point where they say, not only is it in law our capital, look, it's mainly Jewish people.
Professor Ross, we understand that clearly the Jewish people, the Jewish state, I must say, were doing everything in their power to take over that area, the West Bank. Now, what did clearly there are Israel was surrounded, if you like, by Arab countries, Egypt, Syria,
Yeah.
Lebanon. What was there any action by those countries in relation to what they saw, which was
So we
happening?
talked about the 67 war,
Okay,
which they lost. But after that, they began to go to the United Nations to ask for the implementation of UN resolutions, but Israel completely
of course,
refused.
we understand Israel.
And then in 2002,
I'm thinking more about what happened in 1970s, the Yom Kippur War. Most people
oh
might
yeah,
have
okay,
understood
yeah.
that.
So
In
so then
1973.
and that's an interesting date because it's commemorated on the 6th of October,
Yes, I know.
and the recent operation that started from Gaza was on the 7th.
That's why I've
So
mentioned this
people,
is
yeah. So
important.
people, so that's when Egypt and Syria combined together. They attacked Israel, and I think the hope was that they would liberate Palestine.
Of course.
But Israel had so much support from the West, from America, from others, that it managed again to push the Egyptians back,
But if I
particularly the
understand
Egyptians.
correctly, one of the important things, clearly it's important that individuals understand that
Yeah.
Arab nations did try and resist. But
Yeah.
I think it's one of the important things to mention about the Yom Kippur War
Yeah.
is that the Egyptians proved for the first time that the Israelis weren't
Invincible.
invincible. Thank
Yes.
you,
Yeah,
Professor
yeah,
Wash.
yeah, yeah.
And they actually successfully crossed the
They did.
Suez Canal and
And
took
they
over territory. So
and they got the Sinai back.
and you're an engineer, and if I understand it correctly, the Egyptians were able to use extraordinary
Yeah,
engineering
yeah.
capacity to
Yeah,
cross.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So,
So
so,
we,
so, so-
Professor Harris, we now understand that there were resistance from not only the Palestinian
Yeah.
people, but also from Arab states.
because it was an injustice. This is important.
Yeah,
It was a complete injustice that a people couldn't live in freedom, in equality, with justice. So that's why they kept supporting, and they were their brothers. But then if we bring it forward to after that, since then, Israel has been Jewidizing Jerusalem. What do you mean by that? Changing the names of the streets. So whereas you would call it Jerusalem, a Jewish person would call it Yerushalayim, a Palestinian would call it Al-Quds. What they put in the Arabic, so the sign has the three languages, but they started removing Al-Quds and putting Urshalim in Arabic. So and then suddenly you drive around and you don't know where you are because all the settlements have Jewish names. So unless you see Nablus or you don't know where you are. So I started doing that, and they've been encroaching. The most important thing religiously is they've recently been encroaching into Al-Aqsa Mosque, trying to take it over. Even though there was an agreement with Jordan, which is termed the status quo. Jordan has a special place. The king is the custodian of Al-Aqsa Mosque, just like Mohammed bin Salman and his dad in Saudi Arabia are the custodians of the mosque in Mecca and the mosque in Medina. But the Israelis don't accept that. Initially, or until now, their chief rabbi said, you must not ascend that, because they call it a different name. They call it, I've forgotten the name now. Anyway, it's not Al-Aqsa Mosque. They say it's the Temple Mount. That's what they call it.
Yes.
And so what they want to do now, first of all, is to be able to go to the mosque whenever they want. It's a Muslim mosque, a shrine. Whenever they want, time and place, and then there are lots of calls for the building of a new temple, Jewish temple, and those extremists also want Al-Aqsa demolished.
Professor Harris, we understand that the Zionist state, the Israeli states, have been doing all kinds of barbarous things to the Palestinian people in order that they become invisible. What I'd like to ask you is this. Clearly, there's been a lot of activities within the United Nations. There was a so-called attempts for a peace agreement, and the most famous of these, of course, is the Oslo Agreement. Tell us why you believe that all of this failed and that we're where we are today. And then we can talk about
So
what's happening.
Oslo was
currently.
commemorated, its 30th anniversary was commemorated this year. The intention was that it would lead to the creation of a Palestinian state within 5 years, but Israel had no intention of that. In fact, the agreement was that the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized Israel, but Israel only recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole representatives of the Palestinians. So they've never recognized the Palestinian state. Okay, and since then, settlements have been expanding from 200,000-300,000 settlers to now 700,000 maybe, and they keep pushing their people, which is a war crime, incidentally. In international law, it is a war crime to move your people into occupied land. Okay, so that's why Oslo has failed. Israel has no intention of seeing the Palestinians have a state, which are parts of their rights. They have no intention of the refugees returning to the homes they were expelled from. And basically, one of the newest ministers, called Smotrich, who is the finance minister, who was investigated for acts of terrorism, said this only a few weeks ago. The Palestinians have three options. They leave of their own accord, they stay without rights, or if they resist, basically we'll kill them. So that's what Israel is.
Let me understand what's happening here, Professor Awash. There was a wish from Oslo that the Palestinians would have a state. This failed because of the Israeli behavior.
Yeah.
Is it the suggestion that the reason why these settlements are taking place is almost geographically
to make it impossible?
Make it impossible
To make it
for there
impossible.
to be,
Yeah.
because what in South African terms we call Bantustan.
That's right.
It seems that the strategy of the Israeli state is to create within the West Bank, which is the area which is in which the Palestinian people live, is to create a situation that there could not be what they call a contiguous state.
That's correct.
Is that
and
what's
indeed,
happening?
and indeed, that was the deal of the century that Donald Trump proposed. There wouldn't be a Palestinian state really, or if there was, call it whatever you like, but really, it is the Bantustans linked by roads. If the Palestinians inside the Bantustans behave, fine. If not, the Israelis can go back in. So no sovereignty, no contiguity, no respect for them as human beings who have a right to be free. And so if that accumulates, and then just to bring it really to the end of what's happened over the last few days, for the last 2 weeks, the settlers have become increasingly violent. They've been going into towns and cities and trashing Palestinian homes, burning vehicles, doing whatever they like, protected by the Israeli Defense Force, which calls itself the most moral army in the world. It's not. It supports and protects the settlers. And part of the reason is, in the morning, the settlers are in the IDF uniform, and in the evening, they're in their home clothes. So they behave like they are the same thing. But also, there have been huge break-ins into Al-Aqsa Mosque, whereas they should ask for permits to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque from the Jordanian Waqf, not from the Palestinians. The Israelis forces allow them in, and they protect them while they go in, and they pray, and they do all sorts of things. There's no respect for that as a Muslim shrine. So all of that, and the absence of any process for peace, is behind the Palestinians becoming feeling completely helpless on peaceful work.
And in that context, Professor Awash, the Hamas took over the leadership of what is known as the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
Tell us why the Palestinian people have supported what is described as a terrorist organization. Tell us what they represent.
So basically, Hamas wasn't there in 1948. It was created much more recently than that. And it has an Islamic leaning rather than Fatah, which is the other group, major group. There used to be a Palestinian Authority that ruled, within inverted commas, over Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. But then there was a fight between them in Gaza, and the split happened about 17 years ago, 16 years ago, and that hasn't healed. So that's where Hamas comes into the equation. Geographically, it became almost convenient that they ruled over Gaza, and the Fatah group, PA, ruled over the West Bank, and so they haven't come together at any point. So, for example, what happened on Saturday, the Palestinian Authority would have had no knowledge of it happening, none whatsoever.
So why is there such enmity between Hamas and the Israeli state?
Well, because the Hamas sees the Israeli state as occupying Palestinian land. and oppressing Palestinians, imprisoning 5,000 people, restricting the growth of the economy, not allowing people in Gaza to move around and go to visit their relatives in Jerusalem and other places. Most of them have not seen Al-Aqsa Mosque. Most of them have not been to Hebron, to other places. So, and that's the injustice. How is it that a people who came from outside the land now determine where the people of the land can live? And 80% of people in Gaza are refugees from surrounding areas, 80%. And one particular town is worth mentioning, Sedrot, which is an Israeli town. It's about a couple of kilometers from Gaza, was built on the ruins of a village called Najd. In 1948, it was emptied, and its people live in Gaza. They can't even walk, and they can, 2 kilometers back to their village. So bring it again to where we are now. We're witnessing. We saw some horrible events on Saturday.
I was going to ask you, Professor that clearly there have been constant over the years confrontation between Hamas and the Israeli state. They've been we've seen a lot of bombings, etc. And we understand that Israel is trying to contain Gaza and Hamas. How is it Israel is seen and has projected itself as being an extraordinary, almost invincible state, certain in terms of the Arab states? Israel, as many people know, is known as the surveillance experts in the world. We know that they sell surveillance equipment to government, both democratic and despotic, and they use Gaza as their testing ground. How is it that with all of that surveillance which the Israelis pride themselves on, how is it that Hamas was able to achieve what they have done? Most people find this difficult to understand. I don't want you to give away any
No, I don't. In general. No, quite genuinely, I'm not attached to any faction. I have no idea.
I understand.
But I have no idea what happened. But neither do the Israelis at the moment. The Israeli people are asking these questions.
Yes, I know.
Never
mind. I pose it to you.
No, I think they've got an investigation committee, and it will report. We were. I was as surprised as Israelis were on the 7th to see what happened. But these people who went across were going into areas. In 2018, they went to the fence, asking that they go back to their villages, and they were killed. Over 200 people were killed in 2018.
Just for most people to understand, because they have not been there, they don't understand. Explain to us the kind of protective measures the Israelis have put in place to prevent the excursion and the attack which took place. Explain that. As an engineer, you'd know. What structures were there to prevent this from happening? Both in technological terms and in practical terms.
So basically, they built a wall, a fence which is electrified, which has lots of watchtowers, which is dug deep into the ground. The height of the fence is 9 meters, but lots of surveillance, as you say. But it again, we genuinely don't know what happened. But it seems that
if you did know, I wouldn't ask you to tell us anyway. But I'm talking in general.
The evidence is they managed to get through. How and why? And in 4 locations apparently. So and that sends a message actually to those who want to normalize with Israel in the Middle East. And maybe we finish on this. Israel couldn't protect itself. But the Gulf states say they need to have relations with Israel so that it can protect them from Iran. But it couldn't protect itself. All this technology and so on, they couldn't do it. So my message to the Arab normalizers is close these deals, bring back your ambassadors, and for Saudi Arabia, which is a huge country in the Middle East with lots of importance, which has been pushed by the Americans to normalize, please stop the normalization. Stand with your Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Except I know that we've got to finish in a short time, Professor Hawass, because if you're such an, and thank you once again for coming, you're such a busy person. Clearly, we've seen exceptionally that an enormous number of Israelis have been killed. Of course, it has become normal for Palestinian people to be killed. We saw that the Israelis were prepared to exchange one Israeli soldier for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. So that's the importance they place on their own people. Now, in view of the fact that Israel has suffered such extraordinary loss, the last count was I think 900, thousands of people injured. We also know that they've been prisoners taken by Hamas. What do you think the Israelis can do in this situation, and what do you think they will be?
Well, at the moment they're saying they want to flatten Gaza to get rid of Hamas. They haven't talked about prisoner swaps. They've asked for the hostages to be returned. Hamas is saying, "You stop bombing, and we can talk." So I'm afraid over the next few days we're going to. Because Israel is bombing lots of different places, there will be more Israeli casualties amongst the hostages, and maybe even international casualties who are hostages. I pray for their safety. Most of them who are not security people had nothing to do with this, and I hope that they remain safe. But I also want, as we speak, I have no doubt I will read that many more Palestinians are being killed in Gaza, and I want that to end.
Professor Hawash, I understand. Professor Hawash, if I was a Hamas leader and I planned an operation of the type we all know about, it's been so widely publicized, the first thing I'd do, I wouldn't drive around in a car in Gaza. They would have known the Israelis have killed many Hamas leaders, and they've had their surveillance technique. The first thing I'd have done if I planned such a war and such a resistance, I would make sure that either I'm out of the country or I'm totally secured. The Vietnamese, when they were resisting the Americans, did this. They built tunnels, and the Americans were all over the place, and they didn't know. Clearly, the leaders of Hamas aren't stupid, they aren't idiot. They'd have understood guerrilla warfare, and they've shown how effective or successful they can be. Obviously, to my mind, they're not going to expose themselves. So what are the Israelis getting at when they say that they're going to decapitate as Hamas,
exactly.
they're going to destroy
and
Hamas,
that,
and they're bombing to kill the leaders? What does that mean to you?
Unfortunately, they claim that they live and hide amongst the population, so that the population is, they're saying, is a legitimate target. But the pictures coming out show you people who've been, even the Palestinian ambassador, incidentally, has lost his cousin and I think 5 other members of her family in Gaza. So everyone is affected. I keep reading on WhatsApp names of families, not of 1 or 2 people, of 10, 12, 15 people that have died. So I pray for their safety. I hope that our government here will wake up and actually say, supporting Israel to continue in its operation is not the way to attain peace. They must tell it to stop. We will not support you if you continue to kill civilians. Because the question is, how many civilians in Gaza do they need to kill in order for the world to say that's enough? If it is thousands of Palestinians, they're expendable, then my goodness, what I started with, which is that there's anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab racism in the West, becomes absolutely correct.
Professor Hawash, before we finish, we hear the Home Secretary, Cyril Braverman, saying that the police in this country should do everything to prevent citizens of this country, citizens like myself and yourself and others, from showing support to the Palestinian people. Can you tell us what you think about that?
I think she tries to distinguish between support for Hamas and support for the Palestinian people. So
it didn't come over. I've listened. It didn't come over that way to me.
They're trying to use these words to distinguish between them, because protests that happened last night in London, there was one in Birmingham, others around other places. They claim that people were supporting and dancing around to support Hamas, when people are really thinking about the Palestinian people and wanting their suffering to end.
Finally, Professor Hawash, the impression I'm getting, and I've been watching CNN in particular about this, is that an enormous emphasis has been placed on the events which took place in relation to the festival. It's from what I've seen is that from CNN, and I think it's quite disgraceful. And I used to watch CNN a lot, and I think I'm going to stop now. From the reportage I've seen, is that there's been virtually no talk about the hundreds of Palestinian people being killed in Gaza, the destruction of Gaza, and we see an enormous emphasis on that one aspect of what's going on. Can you tell us what you think about this?
I mean, as I said to you, I don't want to see anyone die. The people at the festival, I don't want to see any Palestinian in Gaza die. But there is more of an empathy, unfortunately, in the West with the Israelis than there is with the Palestinians. We are equal human beings, and when they begin to act to reflect that, then we'll see peace come to the Holy Land.
Professor Spangler, what can ordinary people, ordinary listeners, is there anything they can do? I remember speaking to someone in the University of Bagot in Ramallah, and she said to us that to be isolated is worse than death. Is there anything ordinary people can do?
Obviously, people can join demonstrations. We've got one on Saturday in London, and the march from the BBC to, I believe it's to 10 Downing Street. There will be actions locally. So to stand up and to hold the Palestinian flag and to stand with the Palestinian people. Don't celebrate what's happened, but stand with the Palestinian people in their predicament. And write to your MP, try and go and meet them. A lot of them we know are supporters of Israel, but they should feel that actually there are people who care. Okay. Thank you.
And Professor Walsh, thank you very much for privileging us of coming. You've given us 15 more minutes. I know you've been extraordinary, busy, understandably. We hope that we'll have you back soon, that we can discuss the actual development.
I look forward.
We're very honoured that you're able to come. And I myself found all of this very informative.
Thank you so
and I'm
much.
sure our listeners will find it, and viewers will find it informative. And clearly, no doubt, you will make this interview and also the YouTube facilities available to the public. Thank you very much, Professor Walsh. This was extremely interesting.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.